The man who sold me did not look at me when he did it. He was looking at his cards. That is the detail I have carried with me for every year since that night in October of 1859, the detail that sits at the center of everything that followed and gives it its particular shape, not the selling itself. Selling was a thing that happened to people like me with the casual regularity of weather, arrived without announcement, could not be argued with, left damage that you lived with or did not live at all. I had known selling was possible every day of my life. I had watched it happen to people I loved and people I barely knew, and people whose only connection to me was that we occupied the same piece of Mississippi earth under the same man's authority. What I had not watched before was a man sell a person without looking at the person being sold, without pausing the game, without setting down his hand. My name is Ida. I am 29 years old. I was born on the Fenwick Plantation in Yazoo County, Mississippi, in the year 1832, the second child of a woman named Grace, who had been born on the same plantation, and a man named Henry, who had been sold away before I was old enough to fix his face in my memory. My mother described his face to me so many times across my childhood that I have a picture of it made entirely from her words, which is not the same as remembering but is closer to remembering than nothing. She described it as a kind face. She said that in a world that did not produce many kind faces, his was one, and that I had inherited the quality of it, if not the specific arrangement, and that I should not let anyone tell me otherwise. I did not let anyone tell me otherwise, but I am ahead of myself again. Let me tell you about the cards first. Let me tell you about Clement Delamere, who owned me for the 7 years before the cards took me, and about the night in October of 1859 when the game that had been running in the back room of Beaumont's saloon in Yazoo City for 3 days produced a debt that Clement Delamere could not cover with anything he had left except me. Clement Delamere was 37 years old and had inherited the Delamere plantation in Yazoo County from his uncle, who had died without children when Clement was 22. The inheritance had come with 1,200 acres of Delta cotton land and 61 enslaved people, and a house that was larger than any house Clement Delamere had grown up in, and that he had proceeded to treat with the particular carelessness of someone who has received something he did not earn and does not fully believe he deserves. He was not a bad man in the way that some men were bad. He was not deliberate in his cruelty. He was careless in the way that people are careless with things they have not worked for, with the easy destructiveness of someone who has always known there would be more where the last thing came from. He drank moderately and gambled immoderately, and managed his plantation with the distracted attention of a man whose mind was usually somewhere else, leaving the actual operation to an overseer named Pruitt, who was competent and hard, and who ran the cotton operation efficiently enough that Clement's distraction had not yet produced the consequences it was building toward. I had been on the Delamere plantation for 7 years when the cards found me. 7 years of housework, cooking and cleaning and the management of the domestic operation that kept the house functioning while Clement was in Yazoo City, and while he was home, and while the seasons turned and the cotton came in and the money came in, and a portion of the money went directly back out through the back room of Beaumont's saloon. I knew about the gambling from the beginning. I knew because I organized Clement's correspondence, and I had the particular memory that I had trained since childhood, the memory that retains everything because it does not know in advance what will matter. I knew from the correspondence that the gambling was not casual, that it was the kind of gambling that produces debts with specific people who maintain records and expect repayment on schedules that the gambler does not always find convenient. I knew the names of the people Clement owed, and the approximate amounts and the approximate timelines, because all of these things appeared in the letters that came to the plantation with the regularity of a bad season. I knew that Clement Delamere was spending the Delamere plantation the way you spend anything finite when you are not paying attention to the rate of expenditure. I knew before he did that the plantation was going to run out before he stopped spending it. What I did not know, because I could not have known, was that the running out would happen in a single night in October at a card table in the back room of Beaumont's saloon, in a game that had been running for 3 days, and that Clement Delamere had entered on the second day with the particular optimism of a man who is losing and believes that the solution to losing is to continue. He did not continue to his own resources. He continued to mine. The man he lost to was named Harlan Fitch. Harlan Fitch was 45 years old and owned a cotton operation in Holmes County and a reputation in the saloons of Yazoo City and Lexington and Greenwood as a card player of considerable skill and no particular mercy. He was not a man who needed what he won. He was a man who won because winning was what he did, the way other men built things or grew things. Winning was Harlan Fitch's primary occupation, and he was exceptionally good at it. He had been watching Clement Delamare's play across 3 days with the professional attention of a predator, watching something that is not yet aware it is being watched. On the third night, he took everything Clement had left to bet, and when Clement Delamere had nothing left except the clothes on his body and the horse he had ridden to town and the people who worked his land, Harlan Fitch looked at him across the table with the expression of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment and said, "There's still the girl. The one they say runs your house." Clement Delamere looked at his cards. He did not look at me. I was not in the room. I was outside the room, in the hallway of Beaumont's establishment, sitting on the bench where I had been sitting since 8 o'clock in the evening, because Clement had brought me to Yazoo City that day on house business, and the house business had been completed by 4, and the gambling had begun at 5, and I had been waiting ever since for either the game to end or Clement to remember I was there. He did not remember I was there. He remembered that I existed. "There's still the girl," Harlan Fitch said, and Clement Delamere did not look up from his cards when he agreed. I heard this from the hallway. I heard it through a door that was not fully closed, through the sounds of the saloon above and around me, clearly enough that there was no possibility of mishearing or misunderstanding. I heard the terms. The debt was $420, which Clement Delamere had lost across 3 days of play, and could not cover with anything remaining except the woman who ran his house, and who could, Harlan Fitch noted, be valued conservatively at that amount given her age and her demonstrated household skills. Clement agreed. He did not pause the game to tell me. He finished the hand. Harlan Fitch folded. Clement lost again. I sat on the bench in the hallway of Beaumont's saloon in Yazoo City, Mississippi, on a night in October of 1859, and I heard myself sold for a card game debt, and I breathed, and I put what I felt in the place inside myself, where I put things that needed to be kept until I knew what to do with them. Then I sat and I waited for whatever came next. What came next was Harlan Fitch, emerging from the back room with his coat buttoned and his expression arranged into the pleasant neutrality of a man who has had a satisfactory evening. He looked at me on the bench with the brief, assessing glance of a man taking inventory of a new acquisition, and told me to get my things from wherever they were because I would be traveling to Holmes County in the morning. I said, "Yes, sir." He went to settle his account with Beaumont. I sat on the bench. Clement Delamere did not come out of the back room for another hour. When he did, he walked past me without stopping and went to the bar and ordered a drink and stood with his back to the room. I watched him standing there. I thought about 7 years. 7 years of organizing his correspondence and managing his kitchen and keeping the house that his uncle had left him functioning, despite the distraction of the man who nominally ran it. 7 years of knowing what was coming before he did, because I read everything and retained everything and understood the arithmetic of his situation better than he did, because I was paying attention, and he was not. 7 years, and a card game, and $420, and he had not looked at me. I made a decision on that bench in Beaumont's saloon that I want to be clear about because the clarity of it is the foundation of everything that happened after. I did not decide to be angry. Anger was available, but anger was expensive, and I had learned early that expensive things needed to justify their cost, or they were waste. I did not decide to grieve, though grief was also available and would be taken out and examined later in private, when examining it would not cost me anything I needed. I did not decide anything dramatic or immediate. I decided to know Harlan Fitch the way I had known Clement Delamere, completely. And then I decided to use what I knew. The Fitch plantation in Holmes County was 60 miles north of Yazoo City, accessed by a road that followed the ridge between the Yazoo River bottomland and the rolling hills to the east. We traveled it in a wagon the following morning. Harlan Fitch on horseback ahead of us and me in the wagon bed, with a driver named Pompey who had worked for Fitch for 11 years and who said nothing for the first 30 miles and then said, in the particular tone of a man sharing information he considers necessary, that the Fitch place was not like most places and that I should take a week before I decided what I thought of it. I asked him what he meant. He said Fitch was a different kind of man than most of the men in that part of Mississippi, and that different could mean better or worse depending on what you were measuring. I asked him what he was measuring. He looked at me for a moment and then looked back at the road and said that he measured by how many people ran from a place and how many ran toward it, and that from the Fitch plantation the number that ran was lower than most, which was what he was measuring. I thought about that for the remaining 30 miles. The Fitch plantation sat on 800 acres of Holmes County hill country, less productive than the Yazoo Delta land, but more varied, with cotton fields on the flatter sections and timber on the slopes, and a kitchen garden that was the largest and best maintained I had seen on any plantation I had passed through or heard described. It had 83 enslaved people and a main house that was smaller than the Delamere house, and in better condition, and a set of quarters that were, by the measure of what I had seen and heard of quarters elsewhere, adequate in ways that quarters were rarely adequate. Harlan Fitch met me in front of the house when we arrived. He was a different kind of man in the way that Pompey had described, which was to say that he was a man who owned people, and who managed that ownership with a particular set of calculations that produced different results than the calculations most men in his position made. Not better in the moral sense, because the moral sense applied to owning people produced only one answer, and it was not the answer that Harlan Fitch had arrived at or was likely to arrive at, but different in the practical sense. He told me what he expected clearly and specifically, and without the performance of authority that most men in his position use to substitute for actual clarity. He told me I would manage the house, that the house had been managed previously by a woman named Tessie, who had died in August of a fever and whose absence had left a gap that he wanted filled competently. He told me what competently meant in his assessment, which was that the house functioned, that meals were produced on schedule, that the domestic organization of his life operated without requiring his attention, and that anything that required his attention should be brought to him rather than managed around him. He was precise, he was thorough. He did not call me by a name that was not mine. He asked me my name, I told him. He said, "Ida, I expect you to run this house. I expect competence and I expect honesty. What I do not expect is for you to pretend to be something other than what you are, which is an intelligent woman who has been managing a household for 7 years and who is capable of doing it again without instruction." Then he went inside. I stood in front of the Fitch house in Holmes County, Mississippi, and I thought about what had just happened, which was that a man who had won me in a card game had spoken to me as if I had a mind worth acknowledging, and I decided that this was information, and that information was what I collected and what I used, and that I would add this to the collection and see what it became. I began learning the Fitch plantation the next day. What I learned over the following months confirmed and complicated what Pompey had told me in the wagon. Harlan Fitch was a man of considerable intelligence and a set of values that were internally consistent, even if they were not morally defensible from the outside. He believed in efficiency. He believed in the proper management of resources, which he defined as maintaining the productive capacity of everything he owned, including the people he owned, at the highest sustainable level. He did not believe in the waste that cruelty produced. He did not believe in punishment that reduced productivity. He was not kind, but he was consistent, and consistency was something that people who had nothing else to rely on found ways to work with. He was also, as Pompey had indicated, a different kind of man in his financial practices than Clement Delamere had been. He did not gamble with his operations. This surprised me until I understood it better, until I understood that what Harlan Fitch gambled with was other men's operations, and that the card table was where he acquired things, not where he lost them. The Fitch plantation was not financed by debt, in the way that most plantations were financed by debt. It had been built over 20 years with a conservatism that I recognized as I examined his financial correspondence with the same careful attention I had applied to Clement Delamere's, as the discipline of a man who had seen what debt did to other men and had decided not to let it do the same to him. He was not vulnerable in the ways that Clement Delamere had been vulnerable. I sat with this for 3 months. I sat with the fact that what I had learned from 7 years on the Delamere plantation, the letters, the debts, the names of creditors, the arithmetic of a man spending himself faster than his land could replenish him, was not transferable to the Fitch plantation because the Fitch plantation was not built the same way. I had to learn a different architecture. What I learned in those 3 months of careful examination was that Harlan Fitch's operation had one significant vulnerability that his financial prudence had not eliminated because it was not financial. It was legal. Harlan Fitch had, in the course of acquiring properties through card winnings and other transactions over 20 years, accumulated several pieces of land whose title documentation was imperfect, not fraudulent, imperfect. The Mississippi land title system of the 1840s and 1850s was not a model of precision, and transactions conducted in the informal context of gambling debts and private sales frequently produced paperwork that was technically valid, but that would not survive a determined legal challenge. Fitch knew this. He had managed it by ensuring that no one with an interest in challenging those titles had access to the information that would allow them to do so. I found the documentation in his study in the 3rd month. Not by searching, by being in the study with legitimate reasons, as the person managing his household correspondence, and by having the particular memory and the particular attention that turned every document I touched into something I retained completely. I retained the documentation completely, and I began, with the patience of someone who has learned that patience is not waiting but preparing, to understand what it could be used for. I also began learning the men around Harlan Fitch. He had 3 significant relationships that mattered to what I was considering. A lawyer in Lexington named Garfield, who handled his legal affairs, and who was, from the correspondence, a man of professional competence and personal discretion, who knew about the title imperfections and had advised Fitch on managing them. A cotton factor in Greenwood named Dempsey, who handled his sales and whose relationship with Fitch was long and profitable, and whose professional reputation was bound to the accuracy of his assessments of the properties he represented, and a man in Jackson named Corbin, who had been on the losing side of one of Fitch's card acquisitions 8 years earlier, and who had never fully accepted the loss, and who, from 2 letters I found in the back of a correspondence file that suggested they had been kept deliberately rather than filed, was still looking for a way to recover what he considered wrongly taken. Corbin was the most interesting. A man who believes he has been wronged and is still looking for redress 8 years later is a man who has maintained a grievance past the point where most people would have released it. That kind of persistence is useful when directed properly. It moves on its own, once pointed in the right direction. It does not require maintenance or follow-up or ongoing involvement from whoever pointed it. I spent 4 months learning Corbin through the 2 letters, and through the additional information I was able to gather about him, through the particular networks that connected people who paid attention in Mississippi in 1860. In the spring of 1860, I wrote him a letter, not in my own name, not in any name, an anonymous letter written in the formal legal language that I had been reading in Garfield's correspondence for months, and that I could reproduce with the accuracy of someone who has been studying a style not as literature, but as a tool. The letter informed Corbin that information had come to the writer's attention regarding the title documentation for certain properties in Holmes County, specifically 2 parcels that Fitch had acquired, in circumstances that had left the documentation in a condition that a properly motivated legal challenge might find productive. I did not fabricate anything. I described what was actually in the documentation I had read. I described it accurately. I described the specific weaknesses that Garfield had identified in his correspondence with Fitch, and that Fitch had managed by ensuring no one with standing to challenge them knew they existed. Corbin had standing. He had been one of the parties to the original transaction that had produced the title on the first parcel. That standing had not expired. What had expired was his knowledge of the weakness which he had not known about because Fitch had ensured he did not know. The letter gave him back his knowledge. I sent it through a free woman in Lexington named Martha, who did laundry for several of the town's professional families. and whose cousin in Jackson could deliver a letter to a specific address without creating any connection between the letter and the Fitch plantation. 3 degrees of separation. Corbin received the letter in May. By June, he had engaged a lawyer in Jackson. By August, the lawyer in Jackson had communicated formally with the Holmes County Land Records Office and with Garfield in Lexington, requesting documentation related to the 2 parcels whose titles the anonymous letter had described. Garfield brought this to Fitch. I was not present for the conversation, but I heard its aftermath in the quality of the house that evening, in the way that Harlan Fitch moved through it when he returned from Garfield's office in Lexington, in the sounds from his study where he sat for 2 hours before dinner with the silence of a man working through something that does not have an easy resolution. He was not panicked. Harlan Fitch was not the kind of man who panicked. He was the kind of man who assessed and responded, and what he was assessing and responding to was a legal challenge that he had known was possible and had managed by prevention, and that was now, through some mechanism he could not identify, becoming active. He managed it well. He was a capable man, and he had a capable lawyer, and the challenge, while legitimate, was not certain to succeed. It required documentation from multiple sources and the cooperation of a court process that moved at its own pace and could be influenced by the kind of relationships that Harlan Fitch had spent 20 years building in Holmes County. The challenge was manageable. What the challenge did, in being managed, was consume resources. Not financial resources, which was not where Fitch was vulnerable. Legal resources. Attention resources. The particular resource of a man's capacity to manage multiple things simultaneously when one of the things is a legal proceeding that requires careful attention and strategic engagement. I let the legal proceeding develop for 4 months. In October of 1860, I wrote a second letter. This one went to Dempsey in Greenwood, the cotton factor. It described in the language of a concerned professional with relevant knowledge the existence of the legal challenge to 2 of the Fitch plantation's title parcels and its potential implications for the valuation of the properties that Dempsey was representing in his capacity as factor. Dempsey's professional reputation depended on the accuracy of his property assessments. A factor who represented properties with title defects he had not disclosed was a factor whose professional standing was at risk. The letter did not accuse Dempsey of knowing. It simply informed him that he might want to know. He investigated. His investigation produced communications to Fitch that were professional and careful, and that added, to the legal proceedings already requiring Fitch's attention, the additional weight of a significant business relationship that had become cautious. Cautious business relationships are expensive. They produced, in the case of Dempsey and Fitch, a renegotiation of the factor arrangement that moved in Dempsey's favor in ways that the 1860 harvest would make tangible and costly. The 1860 harvest was also for reasons that had nothing to do with my letters and everything to do with the weather patterns of that particular summer in Holmes County, below the previous year's output. Not catastrophically, but in the context of a legal proceeding and a renegotiated factor arrangement and the accumulated weight of a year in which more things were going wrong than had gone wrong before, the harvest shortfall was one weight more than the structure had been designed to carry gracefully. Harlan Fitch was managing. He was a capable man, and he was managing. Then the war came. The war arrived in Mississippi in ways that were not gradual. The secession in January of 1861, and the firing on Sumter in April, and the Union gunboats on the Mississippi River by summer, and the blockade that cut off the cotton markets that the entire plantation economy of Mississippi depended on, all of this arrived with a speed and a totality that no individual action I could have taken would have produced, and that made everything I had been doing smaller and also unnecessary in ways I had not anticipated. The cotton market collapsed. Not the Fitch plantation's cotton market specifically, the cotton market. The entire commercial system that turned Mississippi Delta cotton into English and French textile money was severed by the blockade in the summer of 1861, and what that severance produced for every cotton operation in the state, from the largest to the smallest, from the most prudent to the most reckless, was the same result. Nothing to sell to. Harlan Fitch had 800 acres of cotton that could be grown and ginned and baled, and had nowhere to go. He had managed his finances conservatively for 20 years, and had no significant debt and had more reserves than most men in his position, and none of that mattered against the complete elimination of the market his operation depended on. What I had been doing for 18 months, the letters, the legal challenge, the careful application of pressure to the specific vulnerabilities I had identified in his operation, had produced a structure that was already strained when the war arrived and removed its foundation. A strained structure without a foundation does not survive. By the autumn of 1861, the legal challenge to Fitch's title parcels had produced a preliminary ruling that was not in his favor and that required him to defend in a higher court at a cost that his reserves could cover, but that reduced them significantly. Dempsey had suspended the factor relationship pending resolution of the title question. The cotton sat in the warehouse with nowhere to go. The Holmes County community of planters and merchants and lawyers that Fitch had spent 20 years cultivating was itself disintegrating under the pressure of the war, its members leaving for Confederate service or fleeing toward the safer parts of a state that was becoming steadily less safe. In November of 1861, Harlan Fitch called me to his study. He sat behind his desk, and he looked at me with the direct attention that had characterized every interaction I had had with him, the attention of a man who believed that looking at things clearly was the first requirement of managing them. He said he was going to have to sell the plantation. He said this not as information delivered to a person who needed to be informed, but as a statement made in the presence of someone whose intelligence he had acknowledged from the beginning and who he had decided, across 2 years of my managing his house, had earned the right to be told things directly. The legal proceedings and the market collapse and the war had produced a situation that his reserves could not sustain indefinitely. He was going to sell, while there was still something to sell, rather than wait until there was not. I said nothing. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said something that I have thought about in the years since, with the particular attention I give to things that do not resolve easily. He said that he did not know how the legal challenge had been started, but that whoever had started it had done so with knowledge of his documentation that very few people had access to, and that he had not been able to identify the source. He said this without accusation. He said it with something closer to acknowledgement. I kept my face at the expression I had kept it at for 2 years. He looked at me for another moment. Then he said that in the settlement of the plantation's affairs, he intended to list me among the assets to be sold, but that if I had somewhere I wanted to go, a person who would take me, he would take that into consideration in how the sale was arranged. I thought of my mother. I thought of Clement Delamere not looking at me. I thought of a bench in the hallway of Beaumont's saloon and a card game and $420. I told Harlan Fitch that there was a free woman in Lexington named Martha, and that Martha had a husband who was a free man and who owned the laundry business, and that if the arrangement could be made, I would go there. He said he would arrange it. He did arrange it. In January of 1862, I went to Martha and her husband in Lexington, not as a slave but as a bound servant under an arrangement that was not freedom and was not slavery, and was closer to freedom than anything I had inhabited before. By 1865, when the war ended and the system that had organized all of it collapsed under its own impossibility, I was free in the full sense of that word, which is still not as full as the word deserves, but is fuller than anything I had known. The Fitch plantation was sold in the winter of 1861 to a speculator from Natchez who believed the war would end quickly and that Mississippi cotton land would recover its value. He was wrong about the first and partially right about the second, but not in time to save his speculation, and the Fitch plantation passed through 2 more owners before the end of the war left it in the condition that most of Mississippi's plantation land was left in, which was available for other purposes. Clement Delamere I heard about through the networks that connected people who had survived the same geography. He lost the Delamere plantation in Yazoo County in 1861, not to my doing, but to his own. The gambling that had sold me continued past me and sold other things until there was nothing left to sell. He died in Yazoo City in 1864 of a fever, in a boarding house without distinguishing himself in the Confederate service he had joined the previous year or in anything else. He did not distinguish himself in anything. He was a man who had been given things and spent them without looking at them and died with nothing, which was the fullest possible expression of what he had always been. I did not grieve him. I thought about him occasionally, in the years after, the way you think about a door that has closed and through which something necessary passed. I thought about the bench in Beaumont's hallway, and the cards and the $420. I thought about the night I sat on that bench and heard myself sold by a man who did not look at me and made the decision that would organize the next 2 years of my life. The decision to know Harlan Fitch completely, and to use what I knew. I want to be clear about something, now that the account is nearly done, and I can afford the luxury of clarity. I did not burn anything. The title in this account promises burning, and there was burning. But it was not the burning of buildings or of crops or of the visible structures of the operation I had decided to dismantle. What burned was something less visible and more complete. The network of relationships and financial arrangements and legal standing that held the Fitch operation together, the commercial reputation that Dempsey's caution damaged, the legal clean hands that Corbin's challenge contested, the financial reserves that the combination of legal costs and market collapse and my careful application of pressure to the right places at the right time consumed. That is what burned. The note was the Corbin legal challenge, which was due in the sense that it had been building since the original transaction and was finally finding its moment. I made sure the house was burning before it became due, which is what the account promised. And the house burned in the way that things burn when the fire is set carefully and at the right points and allowed to spread at its own pace. I was sold for a debt of cards. A man looked at his hand instead of at me and agreed to trade me for a number and went back to the game. I spent 2 years in Holmes County, Mississippi, learning the man who had won me and finding the places where what he had built was weaker than it looked, and I burned those places with information and patience, and the letters that I wrote by the particular light available to someone who has been told they are nothing and has decided to use that assessment as a working condition rather than a conclusion. I was not nothing. I was the woman who ran his house and read his documents and understood his operation and found the thread that, when pulled, unraveled it. I was the woman on the bench in Beaumont's hallway who heard herself sold for $420 and decided, in the same breath as the hearing, what she was going to do about it. I was Ida, my mother's name for me, my grandmother's face that my mother described until I could see it, my father's kindness that I carry in my own face even though I never fixed his face in my memory. I was all of that, sitting on that bench, hearing that card game, watching that man not look at me. And I spent 2 years making sure that when the accounting came due, everything he had built with everything he had taken from people who had no choice about being taken from was included in the balance. The balance was paid. I am satisfied with the payment.
This is the story of Ida, an enslaved house servant sold in a gambling debt in Yazoo City, Mississippi, in October of 1859, and acquired by Harlan Fitch of Holmes County, whose plantation was sold in the winter of 1861, following a combination of legal challenges to his property titles, the disruption of his factor arrangement, and the economic collapse produced by the Civil War blockade of Mississippi cotton markets. Holmes County land records document the Corbin title challenge of 1860 and its preliminary ruling of 1861. Dempsey's factor records in Greenwood document the suspension of his arrangement with Fitch in the autumn of 1860. No official record connects these events to Ida. She was transferred to a free family in Lexington, Kentucky in January of 1862 under a bound servant arrangement and was fully freed in 1865. She settled in Lexington and worked in a laundry for 11 years before opening her own small domestic service with 2 other formerly enslaved women. She died in 1893. Her story was preserved by Martha's family, who had known her for 30 years, and passed down through 3 generations as the story of the woman who came to them from Holmes County, with nothing except her memory and her patience, and who had used both in the 2 years before she arrived. with a precision that Martha's granddaughter, who told the story most completely, described as the kind of precision that comes from having nothing to lose and everything to prove, and the particular intelligence that a life spent being underestimated produces when the person being underestimated decides to use it. Clement Delamere is buried in Yazoo City, Mississippi. His grave is unmarked. If Ida's story moves in you the recognition of a woman who understood that being sold was not the end of her agency, but the beginning of its application, subscribe now and join a community that refuses to let these voices be settled accounts. These are the stories of the women who were traded for debts and who made the debt collectors pay, who were handed from one man to another without being looked at and who looked at everything, who were given numbers instead of names and used those numbers against the men who assigned them. Leave a comment. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us what Ida means to you. Because the bench in Beaumont's hallway is where this story started, and what started on that bench ended in Holmes County, Mississippi, in the winter of 1861, with a plantation sold and a woman walking toward Lexington carrying nothing except the most dangerous thing she had ever possessed, everything she had learned, everything she had seen, everything she had remembered while the men around her were not watching, because they had already decided what she was. She was Ida, and she was enough.